Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to the November webinar for the Lake States Fire Science Consortium. I'm Jack McGowan-Stinsky, and I will be moderating the webinar this afternoon. For those who may be joining us for the first time, let me give you a little background. We are funded by the Joint Fire Science Program and are one of 15 regional consortia for fire science exchanges across the country. Our mission is to accelerate the awareness, understanding, adoption, and sharing of wildland fire science information by federal, tribal, state, local, and private stakeholders across the Lake States and the adjacent Canadian provinces of Ontario and Manitoba. We strive to be inclusive and neutral science partners working to foster collaboration among researchers and practitioners and organizations and individuals, and by developing innovative approaches to science delivery, while facilitating dialogue about new science findings and emerging needs. Before we get started, let's take a few seconds to look at our Adobe Connect webinar interface. If you want to ask a question or interact with the attendees, please use the chat box located in the lower right-hand portion of your screen. Make sure that once you type your question, you also click the send button. We'll be monitoring these questions and we'll make sure that there's an opportunity to address them. If you'd like to learn more about the consortium and what we are doing, please visit our website at lakestatesfiresci.net. Please sign up to receive our newsletters and announcements of other activities, and you can also follow us on Twitter and Facebook. We also ask you to please take a short evaluation survey after this webinar. The evaluation is 4 questions and will help us to assess both this webinar and make any improvements we can for the future ones. When the webinar ends, the evaluation should pop up. The link is also in the chat box in the right-hand corner if you'd like to copy it and complete it. Now into today's webinar, Restoration of Fire-Dependent Pine Barren Ecosystems in Northern Wisconsin, Bridging the Gap Between Research and Management Practices. Dr. Brian Sturtevant is a landscape ecologist at the Institute for Applied Ecosystem Studies at the Northern Research Station with the Forest Service. His research investigates broad-scale interdisciplinary questions related to forest dynamics and disturbance ecology with a focus on insects and fire disturbances. His expertise includes spatial analyses, field-based research, and landscape simulation modeling. Dr. Christel Kern, who unfortunately is not able to attend today, Brian's going to be doing both sections, but Dr. Christel Kern is a research forester with the Center for Research on Ecosystem Change, also at the Northern Research Station of the Forest Service. Her research focuses on conventional and ecological approaches to forest management. Several projects include the role of canopy gaps in microtopography and tree regeneration, effects of leaf trees on plant functional diversity, and synthesis of decadal cross-region silvicultural studies. So with that, let's get to the webinar. Take it away, Brian.
Great. Thank you very much, Jack. Can you hear me okay?
Sounds good to me.
Fantastic. Okay, so I want to thank the Lake States Fire Science Consortium for inviting me to do this presentation, and also the support of us through internships that have been very valuable for our respective research programs in this area. And so this, again, it's really at the nexus between research and management. We're working directly with the Chequamegon and Nicolet National Forest in the restoration treatments that they're already doing to address some both basic questions, basic science questions, as well as very applied questions related to the rate of restoration in this area. So really the focus of the presentation, or the backdrop for this presentation, is we've been very successful in gaining some of these competitive internships through the Lake States Fire Science Consortium. We had 2 this year on different projects. The first was Sarah Kelso, and the goal for her internship was to provide some exposure to fire science, some management and forest restoration, in addition to seedbank methodologies, field and greenhouse techniques, plant germination, and identification of vegetation within pine barren ecosystems. And then the second intern was Michael Dunn, and his focus was really looking at hands-on experience in fire science and management, with an emphasis on plant identification within reference communities related to barren restoration. As in both cases, they worked as part of larger teams that enable them to get exposure to standard forestry practices, restoration, as well as the Farm-On protocol. And so the ecological landscapes within which we're working are the Northwest Sands, which would be up in the northwestern part of the state, principally in Bayfield County, and then the Northeast Sands, that's in the northeastern part of the state, and that region would be primarily Oconto, as well as a little bit further to north as well. In both cases, there's extensive glacial outwash systems as well as sandy moraines in these areas that are primarily excessively drained, sandy and sandy loam soils. So open temperate grassland systems have been greatly reduced and are considered globally threatened ecosystems. And these fire-dependent pine barren ecosystems are a component of those temperate grasslands. And so for those of you that, of course, within the lake states, you may be familiar with this term, but for folks that may be outside of this, they're just not used to the term pine barrens as meaning it really in open landscape. So the formal definition of a pine barren is areas that contain pine, but at a density of less than 1 tree per acre. Two good examples here, one from the Northeast Sands on the left-hand side. That's going to be the Spread Eagle Barrens in Florence County. Second is the Moco Barrens, part of the Northwest Sands ecoregion in Bayfield County. And major opportunity exists here for restoring northern dry forests as well as pine barrens and bracken grassland communities. So first project focus on is restoring northern dry forests and barren communities within the Northeast Sands area. So the research participants, primarily within the Northern Research Station, myself, Christel, Kern, Deahn, Donner. There are others involved as well in the more social component, but I'm going to focus on the ecological component here, as well as really important ties to the Lakewood Llano Ranger District of the Squamish-Nicolet National Forest. John Lambour, Scott Anderson, Jay Saunders, Scott Lynn, Tim Sauter, Mark Gilley, and Jeff Seevelt. Really, this is an opportunity for us to learn more about efficacy of different restoration techniques, taking advantage of some of the treatments that they have planned in this area. So if you took a look at the history of this area, and it's not that different from the Moco Barrens, where pre-settlement fire was a very strong component of the ecosystem dynamics. And then about the late 1800s would be the big pine era, where a lot of this landscape was denuded of the extensive forests, in particular the big pines were the targets. By the 1930s, about the time that these national forests were established, they were left with a lot of area to reforest. And so some of the primary goals of the Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC, was forest restoration. And what you can see in this image here is some furrowed, what they call furrowed land, where they disc the land in order to make planting space within the grassland for establishing jack pine. And what's ironic about this image is that the areas that they targeted perhaps first, or at least the easiest ones to restore, would be the ones that were more open and easier to plant. And so at present, what we're looking at is some very heavily stocked stands, and in general and regionally, our stocking densities are much higher than they were in the past. And so this will give you just a sense of what the study design is. This is actually an outdated slide. We've got 105 sample points that were selected, and all of these are now measured by this point, that were randomly selected from a grid based on the planned treatments and the desired future condition for those treatments. We split things up according to whether they were deciduous versus conifer-dominated systems, and then what the eventual goals for those sites were. The kinds of variables that we're measuring are mature trees, herbaceous vegetation, the regeneration, shrubs, fuel loads, as well as butterflies. And what was added as part of the internship, some value added, was some seed bank work because in the related study to the northwest, we're also collecting seed banks, and the vegetation across the two different sites are somewhat unique, and so it just provided an opportunity to better link these two projects. So just to give you an update again, all sampling points established with the pretreatment data, all that is now done. And the harvest treatments have started, but the burn treatments are expected to begin in 2017. So focusing a little bit more on the seed bank itself, the methods that we use here are to go to the quadrats where we're collecting vegetation, and nearby the quadrats, at least in the case of this study, so that we don't disturb the vegetation that's there. We're taking soil cores using this kind of bowl planter here, and it'll have a known diameter. We can measure the duff layer that's within that and separate out the duff versus the very top of the mineral soil. And then we mix those with a sterilized medium and then grow those out within the greenhouse. And the idea is that rather than sifting through these samples and looking for seeds, which is a method for seed banks, we're really looking at seed viability, which we feel is a more ecologically relevant variable for what happens when disturbance occurs on these sites. And so that'll just give you a little bit of a sense. We filled a greenhouse with these samples. They take approximately about 3 months to grow out in ID. Another focus of this study was focusing on the reference community. So, knowing what you have for an existing condition here in the Lakewood, if you take a look right here, it would be what you'd see, and that would be among the more open woodland types right here. A lot of it is much more dense than this, and the desired future condition looks a bit more like this that you see on the lower right. And so to compare those against sites that are actively managed now for barrens, what the target communities might be, we moved to two areas owned by the Wisconsin DNR. This would be the Spread Eagle Barrens and the Dunbar Barrens to the north in Florence County. And we're looking at areas that have some conifer component, but primarily open, again, according to the definition of savannah to open barrens. Again, we thank our colleagues over in the Wisconsin DNR for their support as well. So the methodology in terms of measuring vegetation characteristics comes straight out of the Fireman Fire Effects Monitoring and Inventory System. And this is just an example of measuring the fuels and the shrub belt at the Spread Eagle area, just to give you a sense of what that landscape looks like. And we also conducted butterfly sampling using open pan techniques. And this year was a learning experience for us. In previous years, when we were in primarily forested conditions, this worked really well as a way of basically you put out sugar water that attracts the butterflies that are pretty low densities within those forested systems. And it works quite well. If you go to these open systems, presumably the densities of butterflies are much higher, which they are. But what we learned from this is that because you can see for long distances, they turned out to be bird feeders, and the birds were starting to pick them off. And so we've got to change our methodology based on the sampling that we've used so far. We get an idea of the community composition, but certainly density not so much. Okay, I'm going to move on now to the second study, which is manipulating soil heating patterns to optimize Barrens restoration. This is a project that was funded in 2015 by the Joint Fire Science Program. And it's in that area, the Northwest Sands and the Washburn Ranger District. There are a lot of cooperators On the science side, either from the Northern Research Station, myself and Christel, as well as Randy Kolka, Matt Dickinson, and Deahn Donner, and Jessica Meisel from Michigan State University. And key personnel out of the Washburn Ranger District included Matt Bushman, Jen Raybuck, Vance Hazelton, Dan Hinson, Brian Haringa, and Michelle DeValis, the district ranger there. And so, again, without this coupling between research and management, there's no way that we can do the burning at the kind of scale that's occurring as they are on these open barrens. So the research opportunities is quite extraordinary. This is an area unlike the Lakewood Southeast where MOCA or Barrens restoration has been occurring for quite some time, about 60 years of active restoration treatments. In principle, the focus historically has been on sharp-tailed grouse and restoration of that population there. And in fact, the last year they reinitiated some reintroductions of sharp-tailed grouse to supplement the populations that are there, with the expectation that over between this year and next, about 200 birds from Minnesota being relocated to the Moco Barrens area. All right, so we had two principal objectives for this study. The first was really a basic question. There's a soil heating model that's available called the Campbell Soil Heating Model. It's available in the FOFIM system. And that model was derived from laboratory experiments and has not actually had a true field validation. So part of our research question was an actual field validation of that model within sandy ecosystems. The second was look at the second order effects of soil heating on things that are relevant to Barrens restoration. So that would include hardwood regeneration, the seed bank, soil fertility, and vegetation. And so if you think about this in terms of how these endpoints of the system occur, so you've got on the one hand, you've got pine forests, primarily closed pine forests in the system at the moment, or at least in the surrounding areas. You've got hardwood forests, and then you've got open canopy systems that would comprise woodland versus savanna versus barren systems. And they're, depending on what you do in these systems, will push it towards a particular type. And so depending on if you leave it alone and natural succession occurs, it'll point you towards a direction, or if you do planting, or if you do burning and what the burning will actually do. And the concept underlying this project was looking at the role of, can we manipulate the heat that goes into these burns, depending on the fuel loads in particular, and if we can manipulate that variable, will it push us further towards our goals, in particular either towards these pine systems or really towards these more open canopy systems as well? And if you think about this on two different axes, and this is relevant for the other study area as well, is that, in terms of fire risk, these pine-dominated systems are highly flammable and pose a pretty significant fire risk. Versus these hardwood systems that, of course, don't burn very well. But in terms of their conservation value, one of our goals is to increase the proportion of pine forest. But then if you compare that with these open canopy systems that were historically much more abundant in both of these study areas, the regional conservation value of those are much higher, and the risk is moderate in between the two. Trying to protect against fire in an area that's a grassland where you can use a dozer is very different from a canopy fire that you might see in a pine forest. So that gives you the context for why the restoration treatments are taking place. Just to give you an overview of the Moco Barrens restoration area, it's a pretty large area for those of you who haven't been there. What I'm showing here are just the block treatments. So these would be blocks that would be burned in any given year. They don't necessarily burn the entire block at the same time. In 2016, they burned block I, shown here, and most of block F, about this portion, about 2/3 of that block was burned, about 3,000 acres in total. Next year, they've got Block J slated for treatment, prescribed burning, and Block D shown over here towards the eastern side. And then here's the research natural area that I'll talk to a little bit later, which is a square mile area that hasn't been burned in over 80 years. So the study design for this project is we're looking at what the historic state was, and for this case we're using documents from about 1951, defining whether it was a pine or a deciduous or a grassland system, versus what its current state is. So are you in a woodland, or are you in a transition between that woodland and a grassland system, brush, or are you currently in a grassland state? And then within those treatments, there are fuel types or fuel treatments that we use. I show them here: additions, removals, and brush cut. One of the treatments that they apply in this area is brush cutting hardwood material to increase the heat loading in those areas, and to kind of do a 1-2 punch to eliminate the or at least knock back the hardwood regeneration that's occurring. So if you hit it with brush cutting the previous year during the growing season, and then you burn it, you're adding heat, and you're also hitting it twice. And so we use those fuel treatments to manipulate soil heating or potential for soil heating by either adding brush to sites that wouldn't normally have them, or removing them from sites that have been brush cut, or just using the brush cut at sites that are there. In general, those fuel manipulation treatments were paired, such that each manipulation plot had a paired plot that had similar characteristics. We're burning 2 blocks per year, and again, I say we, that would be the Washburn Ranger District is responsible for that. And to the extent possible, we evenly distribute those across the burn blocks. And in terms of the year of burn, 2 burn blocks in 2016 and 2 in 17. The season of burn is generally mid to late May. Target is about when the aspen leaves are about dime size is when they're targeting. So just to show you a couple examples of treatments that are perhaps unusual or unfamiliar. So this would be the pine woodland treatment, and I've contrasted 2 areas where you have to decide, is it really a pine woodland or is it something else? And so if you look to the lower right, this would be considered a pine woodland, where they've thinned a plantation down to much lower density to allow some of that light to hit the understory. And you can see in this case the hardwood regeneration that's responding to that increased light. And then if you look at the upper right-hand side, even though there are conifers on site, it's really a grassland or a savannah system. And so in terms of treatment, we would consider that that upper one would be a grassland, the lower one would be a woodland. This would be what one of those brush cut treatments looks like. Fairly heavy loading of fuels in this particular case. Typical fuel loads in some of these areas would be on the order of, say, 30 tons per acre. And you can take a look. It's not just in the forefront, but this entire slope here was brush cut. So in 2016, they treated about 800 acres of land. 2017, much lesser area. So in order to establish the kind of the physical amount of heating that occurs, the sites were instrumented. Of course, instrumentation is expensive and it's difficult to set up at the time of burn. And so there's kind of a hierarchy of instrumentation that we applied. For most of the sites, there was no instrumentation out of our 56 plots per year, but a subset of those, what we call type 2, would include radiometers that look at the heat profile as the burn proceeds. There's heat-protected video cameras that allow you to capture that fire behavior as it moves its way through the plot. And then you've got these thermocouple probes that are entered at different locations within that plot. And then in an even smaller subset, we've got some heat flux setups that look at the profile of heating as it goes into the soil layer. And just to give you a sense, again, we're using the Farm-On protocol. It's only a slight difference from what we're doing in the Lakewood Leona area, pretty close in terms of design. And you can see the central area that's instrumented if it were an instrumented plot. We've got different quadrats where we're assessing vegetation and also severity impacts as well. And then soil samples occurring as close as possible to the areas of instrumentation. We've got our seed bank samples that are also occurring fairly close to that instrumentation area. Our fuel transects, shrub and sapling belts, and the larger macro plot where we're measuring trees in areas where they exist. So this image will give you a sense of what one of the burn treatments look like to a fuel addition plot. So this would be a plot that was toward a grassland condition, so it had less than 30% cover by hardwood regeneration. And the signatures were pretty abrupt when you took a look at the kind of intensities that we could achieve with these fuel addition treatments. After the burn took place, we would then go and take some standard fire severity metrics, some soil samples. We would get our post-fire seed bank samples as well. We were using heat-sensitive paint tags to kind of extrapolate some of our instrumentation to our other plots. And we measured duff consumption as well. And just some preliminary findings from this work. In general, we got a strong range in terms of surface fire intensities. In fact, Matt Dickinson, who's really the lead on the instrumentation, who's done this kind of instrumentation work across the country in California and also the central hardwoods. These were hotter fires than he was used to. In fact, we actually melted some of the equipment, and it was hot enough to melt the aluminum that we use for the paint tag. So just to give you an idea of surface fire intensities, it's about 660 degrees to burn aluminum, so that'll give you a sense of what the intensities we could achieve in those areas that had those fuel additions. And despite that, the soil heating was generally low. I've got it here most below 60 degrees. 60 degrees is a benchmark in terms of where actual impacts to vegetation, where you get necrosis of vegetative tissue, generally occurs around that threshold. Actually, most of our observations were below 40 degrees C, and we got a few examples that were just above 60 C. In terms of the implications, one of the key implications that's coming out is relevant to season of burn. And so the surface fuels were generally very, very dry at this time, on the order of less than 10% for most of the surface fuels, including 10-hour fuels and our litter as well. But the soils at that time of year are cool, and the duff was generally pretty wet, on the order of, say, 20 to 65% moisture content. And so some of these sites that were burned very hot, when we looked at duff consumption, it was actually far less because of the insulating properties of those wet duff and soil. Really briefly on the focus on the MOCWA Natural Research Area, or the Research Natural Area. The Research Natural Areas in general are a network of sites that are established across the National Forest System, and they are intended to serve as a benchmark for different kinds of communities. This particular natural area was established in 1935. And the original question that they were asking was, what would naturally take place under fire protection alone? In particular, how long might it take for a more open system to recolonize to a more forested condition? And so, again, established about the 1935. It hasn't been burned since then. There was no other kind of disruption to the soil, no furrowing or anything like that in there. And so one of the major intents of the internship position was to remeasure some plots that were established by folks at Wisconsin, which were Dunn and Stearns would have measured plots in the late 70s. And we remeasured those plots to the extent that we could. You can see how they're distributed across the study area. Those sites shown in green were all measured, 12 plots in total. There are also shown in red some photo plots that you can see. And for the most part, this is largely converted over to closed forest. There are a couple of examples of pot grassland systems that may be embedded within this, but succession is certainly proceeding within this area, and this will help close the loop on that initial question. The current question in terms of our own research project, we highlighted this area as a great place that could serve as reference conditions for the broader research or manipulated areas, in particular because it had such a long history without disturbance. And the question then becomes, well, a reference for what? And so this certainly will serve as a reference for closed canopy conditions and maybe a couple spotty examples of open woodlands. Most of the grassland sites that are remnant aren't really large enough to establish a full-size plot. Our plots are on the order of about 1/3 of an acre. So now I'm just going to talk a little bit about, kind of what was gained from the perspective of the interns and what we've gotten out of the program. And so in terms of what they identified, would include things like heightened plant ID skills, introduction to new field techniques, an opportunity to practice and sharpen their field skills, experience with the Farm-On protocol, and then an opportunity to be able to work with a variety of people on different projects. And that included not only the people from the research teams, but also the people from the district, which I think is really the target that they're looking for in this intern program is, can you find people that are trained that can kind of speak both languages? It's a common issue, I would say, of researchers kind of going off in their own direction and not necessarily being as relevant as they could be to the people that need answers on the ground. And so this is really an ideal situation for these interns to get experience from both the research and practical management, and how research can be used to address those. And so just some quotes from Sarah. It would be, the experience allowed me not only to practice utilizing my field skills, but enabled me to strengthen them by sharing knowledge with others that I work with who came from different backgrounds and different experience levels. And then from Michael, who worked in the RNA, his favorite part was, in fact, collecting the data on woodland vegetation in that research natural area, and really as a comparison to what he was seeing out in the Barrens. And so I found that really interesting as well. And how was this experience in terms of value to them? I think we got high marks on in each case. Sarah says that the experience was one she'll look back on and draw on for years to come as she prepares herself for a career in natural resources research. She's standing there in front of the greenhouse samples, just to give you a sense of the kind of the magnitude of the work involved and how she was able to assist with that. She's looking, right now, she's actually looking at the samples from Moqua to assist the person who was focused primarily on the Moqua area. And the time period required to do these greenhouse trials is about 3 months. So we worked from mid-July through late October. Sarah was only there through early August, so she was there to kind of get things established and then begin the initial emergence data and photo series and things like that. They identified in total for over the course of this 62 unique plant species identified. Of those, 29 were identified down to at least genus. The remainder of the ones that weren't identified were at least identified to the kind of plant that it was. They know it's a unique plant, and those are still continuing to grow. so that as they begin to put on more mature aspects of the vegetation, they'll be easier to identify. The photo series that will come out of this will really facilitate next year's seed bank trials, and so Sarah was also involved within that. For Michael Dunn, his experience suggested that he learned a pretty complicated protocol for data collection. He was surprised at how easy, that became within a week or so of time. He had never done any of the fuel measurements, collected duff, litter, or soil samples, never used the USDA plant codes, and now he thinks of those every time he sees them. So I think he got quite a bit. You can see him on the far right of the photo here. And in terms of value to us, what this internship enabled us to do, which is above and beyond the joint fire science, is really addressing the question for which that RNA was initially established. And in general, these research natural areas it's a great program. There's a lot of these potential reference sites that are out there that have very limited intervention. And in general, they're pretty underutilized. And so this was a case where we could take with a little bit of resource and address a question that was long-standing. And what's helpful for that is that it may actually enable a change in direction for the future purposes of this RNA if they want to do some manipulations in the future. I would say in general, just by way of overview, this program from the Lake States Fire Science Consortium, its internship program, has been of real value to us. What it does is, we're not talking about a lot of funds, about $4,000 per intern, but it enables you to kind of leverage the work that you're already doing and then expand into an area that you wouldn't have been able to otherwise do. And it also really focuses, our work in terms of the research on how do we bridge that gap between research questions and what it really means on the ground for land managers by just encouraging that cross-collaboration between research and management. So kudos to the program for sure. I wanted to thank again our land management partners for which this, without which this research would not be possible. Really an amazing group of people, and really allows us to do some pretty interesting research as well. I also wanted to thank the co-PIs on the different projects, Jessica Meisel, Randy Kolka, Matt Dickinson, Deahn Donner, in different areas. They're all pretty well involved. Professional support, particularly wanted to thank Heather Jensen for helping to put this presentation together, but also some great contributions from Sue Leitz. I've got field support. It's just too numerous to list. There's a lot of people that contribute to this, and of course the interns were part of that. And I think they appreciated being part of such large teams. And the financial support from the Joint Fire Sciences Program, the Northern Research Station, as well as the Lake States Fire Science Consortium. And I guess with that, I'd like to take any questions you may have.
Well, thanks, Brian. Just a reminder, folks, we got some typing, it looks like, but type your questions in that chat box. Brian, while we're waiting, hopefully get some questions coming in. I do have one for you. You mentioned that the season of burn, and it looked like you're saying the burns that you had were mid to late May, but that there's, with the higher soil moisture, you had insulating properties. Do you have any intent to hopefully expand the research and look into different parts of the growing season where that soil moisture may be drier and you lose that insulating quality, but the live fuel?
So, great question, and so I guess there's two parts of that. We actually, knowing that this may be an issue, and that the district was, for the moment at least, restricted in terms of what, there's a lot of restrictions in terms of when you can burn, a lot of reasons for why you can burn, in terms of fire danger rating, as well as when the resources are available, both for funding and for personnel. And so there are many reasons for why people may burn in the spring, but perhaps as we may hear from Jed in the next session, there's also good ecological reasons for why you might burn at a different time of year. And so the answer to your question is that for the purpose of this study, I think we did discuss the opportunities for burning at different times of year, and I think those are going to be opportunistic. If they occur in the same study area or close by, we'll take best advantage of them as they can. They almost conducted a small burn this year in the fall, but for those of you who live in this area, it was a soaking wet fall, and so they didn't end up burning at that time of year. You know, I guess the other side of that is, at least from what we're seeing, you know, the duff does act as an insulator. The duff depths in these kinds of ecosystems, of course, it depends on which stage you're in, but they are generally thin. So I think the median was about 2 centimeters in depth for the duff, which is pretty thin relative to more forested systems. And so it certainly has that issue, but it you know, there's I think there is opportunity to manipulate the surface fires to do some impacts below ground. And then I guess the final is, I think if the duff were drier and it could burn more deeply, there is this sense that it can serve as its own fuel source. And we had hoped we had done some manipulation to see if we can get that to dry out. And we weren't successful in having it really dry out and burn independently, from what we can tell. And I think that just has to do with the depth. And so if you think about duff as its own independent fuel source, if the duff were thicker, then it would have the opportunity to combust less completely, but have a longer residence time, and that would allow more heat to penetrate below surface. So kind of our preliminary results, what we're seeing is that this system may not have enough duff in order to actually do that. So does that answer your question, Jack?
Oh, sure. No, that was a good answer, kind of to explore and explain kind of the variations and differences, both in season and in soil types and in duff layer and that kind of thing. So just was kind of exploring that. And you did mention residence time, which is good. I was curious, is there any way to track ignition patterns too and the amount of residence time, or was that, I mean, you're obviously doing monitoring after. I don't know if during the fire.
So that is the purpose for the sites that are instrumented. We can do that. That's what the heat-protected video is for. That has a time signature associated with it, and the radiometer has a time signature associated with that as well. And so, and even the thermocouples, they all are time-stamped. And so that allows you to kind of look at that. And I didn't go into this in detail, but the method that they use for prescribed burning in this area when they can is by doing the black line around the edges and then setting off the middle using helicopter ignitions. And I think we had, I know of one case where our plot took a direct hit from some of the ignition balls, and so you can actually see that signature in the severity metrics when you go out there. And so that'll give you some indication just based on the evidence that's there. And for the sites that are instrumented, you'll capture that. But for those more extensive sites, you're going to have to rely on the severity metrics that you take.
Definitely, definitely. No, it's also nice, though, that it's incorporated in larger acres burn, too. So you can kind of getting that comparison.
Well, absolutely. I think the scale of the burns was what really attracted us to this because, you know, there's a lot of heterogeneity within those that we can take advantage of.
So. Well, there's a lot of typing going on. I only see one that showed up so far. Matt Deahn,
Sure.
question. And can you see that, Brian?
I can. So let me see. So the past manipulations in both the Northeast and Northwest, and given that much of the Northeast are brackens, can you tell us what your observations are to date for the Northwest sands regarding plant and seed bank persistence, our native pine barrens species showing up? I would love to be able to tell you this. It is our first year of data collection, and we're right in the middle of that. And so, you know, I can tell you some more general things, which would be more the experience that I've heard from the district themselves and more of the long term. And that would be that there is certainly a lot of bracken there, and that is something that comes up, especially in the forested, you know, sites that were previously forested. And they do find sites, and it's one of the reasons why we focused on seed banks for this particular study, especially when they go into a plantation that they're now opening up. They may have to go in and actually seed in areas if they don't get decent vegetation coming back. So it's this conversion process that may be at issue. But in terms of our own data, we don't have it yet. We actually have to analyze that part. So next year I might be able to answer that better.
Good. All right. The BIA, Great Lakes Agency Plus, they have another question. Do you want me to read it for you, or?
Let me see. I think folks can. So let me see. You say you only look to burn opportunistically in other seeds. So without following the results of this and other research, are you really linking research to management? Let me see if I understand the question here. I think I understand. So I would say there is a general sense that I'm hearing, and this is just my own, you know, this area is, as we get into this whole area of restoration using prescribed fire, and particularly these Barrens ecosystems, for me it's somewhat new. And as I talk to the land managers that are out there and they're doing this, it's exactly this kind of response that I get. We know this. This is, you know, why aren't we burning during other seasons? And what I'm hearing from many of them is that intuitively they know this, but the pushback that they may get is, well, prove it. And so I guess one thing that I can offer from the work that we're doing is that we will absolutely be able to prove precisely what it is what the impacts are. So what the first order effects are in terms of soil heat penetration, and we can show that these sites are indeed very intense in some cases, so that it's working as intended, but in terms of what goes up, but in terms of what goes down, that looks like it's far less effective at this time of year. And so I think with that kind of data in hand, hopefully they'll be able to make an argument, a much more scientifically based argument, for what they're really seeing intuitively. And I don't know if that answers your question, but that's the response that I'm getting is thank you for collecting the data and at least nailing this question down.
And I think the question referred back to the one I had asked about exploring growing season burn results compared to the either early growing season or dormant. But you did address that often we do have enough information to know that changing the season of burning is good, but there may be other non-scientific reasons, like you said, capacity, it might be the end of the funding cycle. So there's other things that are not related to fire science that may minimize the ability to do growing season burns versus the earlier spring burns.
That's right. From a kind of a practical standpoint, if you plan your burns for, say, September, and all your staff is out in California fighting your fires out there, you've missed your opportunity. And so by burning in May, it's kind of a sure thing, but are you actually doing what you intended to do?
Correct. So that's for, I guess, all the audience to think about. If we have information to show that during the season of burn is good, one of the barriers may be how do we get that across so that it's how would I say it, less linked to a funding cycle, or there's a longer funding cycle, so that we can move from opportunistically burning in other seasons to deliberately doing different seasons of burning. So it's kind of teasing out some of these barriers and backing that up with the fire science to show why we want to do that.
Right.
In this back to your study.
Yeah, that's right. I see a message or a question here from Kurt Kitzmiller about historically what was the season of burning on these. I think, Kurt, I think I would say stay tuned to the presentation that Jed Manier is going to be presenting next month, because I think he's got some very excellent and very interesting data that has to do with growing season based on that endocrinology work. And I think I'd like to have him speak to that more directly. In fact, if he's on the line, maybe he could. But you know, my sense of things is that it was more likely later season burns. But I think, like I said, tune in to Jed's. I think it'll be a great presentation then.
Okay. We have a couple more questions, comments from the BIA Great Lakes Agency. Address those, Brian?
Let me see. Research in the fire-dependent ecosystems in California indicate germination of fire-associated plants is influenced not only by heat but even smoke. I've seen that research as well, and it's very interesting to get at that question. That requires experimental work. It's not that we couldn't do it. We've talked about doing work like this, perhaps using the Forestry Products Lab down in Madison. They've got the facilities to do that kind of work, but it really requires laboratory experiments to look at that particular question. Really what we can address is before and after. So when you take a look at what's emerging before and what's emerging after in terms of both the composition and the abundance, we should be able to get towards that question, but it won't be able to answer it definitively because we can't control all the variables. And related to that, it looks like if you considered seed bank viability might be affected if the seeds are not subjected to fire effects. I think, well, that is part of the point, right? And so by taking the seed bank samples immediately before the burn, which is what we do, and then immediately after the burn, and then comparing the response, we should be able to look at that particular question. Again, we're not going to be able to tease it out experimentally, but we should be able to get at that question of viability that's related to the burn itself. Let me see, from Susan here. Kansas State working on an alternative and successive season of on burn, and it looks like, so thank you. Yeah, I'd be very interested in some of the results that you've got, because I think it has a lot of relevance to the kind of restoration treatments that they're doing in this area of the world. So, so I guess, Susan, we'll stay tuned to your results. 2018, will you have a Lake States webinar around that time?
Or one of the other exchanges, maybe?
Sure.
Certainly. Good one.
Okay, so from Kurt, we see a lot of variation in northern Minnesota fire histories, but very different system from a forest perspective. It shows up in early reports as well as where fires are almost equally probable during spring, summer, and fall. Fire size may also differ. So, you know, that's interesting. I guess I don't, you've got a couple things perhaps that are going on. You've got natural fires that are occurring from, lightning ignitions, and then you've got fires that are ignited by native communities. And so it may be a question of which of those are dominant, and I think in the upper Midwest, it's really an open question and may have to do a lot with what were the practices of the Native American communities at those times. So very fascinating question.
And we did have a webinar last March that Evan Larson gave it. Kurt was part of that study and was looking at the border route and looking at kind of the fire history. And there's been a number of other fire history studies.
Yeah, and
go ahead.
And Kurt, I hear you. So he says, a sample size of 1, this is clearly an area, I think, especially from the feedback even I'm getting on this webinar, that it's a pretty hot topic, and hopefully that'll spur some research in this area, because I think that whole question of growing season is a very important one. Growing season burns.
Definitely. It looks like Kurt agrees too. And others.
Mm-hmm.
And Susan Buckley responded, it looks like Great Plains would be the Fire Science Exchange or consortium that would gladly take a look at your data in a webinar format.
Mm-hmm.
See any other questions coming in? I'm going to scroll back to the top though, because we did have one chat from Ashley Ann. It was more of a comment that had to do with the butterfly monitoring. She said, your neighbors in Michigan, Illinois, and Iowa all use the citizen science butterfly monitoring program using polar base, which works in all systems with 6 surveys per year.
Yeah, and actually I really appreciate that, because I think I would say the butterfly surveys would, again, be somewhat new to our team, and it's good to get that feedback, because I think it's a great question about, pollinators are, of which the butterflies are a component, are really important from a biodiversity and ecosystem perspective. So I think getting at good, effective ways of monitoring those, I think, is essential for some of these restoration sites. So thank you.
Definitely. It looks like there's 1 or 2 more typing. Okay, BIA, Great Lakes Agency, asked, have you considered the influence of fire interval and number of past burns in your research?
So that's a good question. We do have the fire history for the most part is in terms of the MOQA area. They do have decent records on where the fires have occurred and when. And so when we established the plots, we did the best that we could to accommodate the different treatment types, but not necessarily burn history. And I would say burn history is one very, very important one, but the other one that was important was that furrowing. And I don't know if you saw what those furrows look like, but they have a dramatic effect on the soil profile. And really, they're so visible in some of those areas, they're hard to miss. In fact, if you're walking out there, be careful. And so I would say those 2 things are what are essential to keep track of, the furrowing history and the burn history. And I think because of the way that we're limited in our ability to find sites across treatments, we're going to have to look at those 2 variables as covariates.
Excellent. All right, I see one more person typing. I guess let's give another second or 2, see if we get in the last question or 2. Oh, no, it's Kurt responding. Very interesting work. Thanks for the webinar.
Well, sure. Thank you all. Thank you for the opportunity. I think this is a great program.
Yep. So, yeah, it looks like we could wrap it up with the questions here. And, Brian, thank you so much. Excellent webinar. I want to thank everybody also online for joining us this afternoon and for all the questions. If you'd like to review this webinar or share with someone who might be interested but missed it, I'll have a recording of the webinar up on the Lake States Fire Science website later this afternoon. Let me go to the next screen here. So our next webinar is December 15th and 16th. It's going to be reconstructing historical fire regimes and forest structure in Wisconsin's red pine-dominated forest. That's Jed Munier, and he's with the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources. And like Brian hinted, looks like Jed has some good information on seasonality of burns. And with that, again, thanks, Brian, and everyone for participating today. And when I close this link out, you should have a very short survey. So I encourage everybody to take the few minutes to do the survey of the 4 questions to help guide us. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, thanks all.